Hello and welcome back. In my last lecture on my YouTube channel on literati, I had discussed some aspects of poetry and prose both. I would like to share a few more pointers. It is understood and it is very apparent, it is very clear, it is very obvious that poetry as a form of creative expression, as a form of literary expression, is much more ancient than prose writing. Apart from the epics of the West, Iliad and Odyssey by Homer, we have our own vast body of Sanskrit literature, which comprises of both Gadya and Padya. Gadya means prose and Padya means poetry. There are all kinds of poetic writing. The epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, the poetic dramas, Abhigyan Shakuntalam, Swapnavasav Dattam, Mritchakatikam, all by great poets like Kalidas and Bhasa and Shudraka. Another interesting aspect about these poetic dramas in particular is that they are a mixture of poetry and prose. The refined characters speak in poetry, speak in very refined and beautiful and expressive poetry, and the minor characters, the conversation is in ordinary prose. Of course, that prose also has a literary quality. So what does this remind us of? Another similarity with the English poetic dramas, which are of course the Shakespearean dramas and the Elizabethan dramas, in which we find exactly the same technique where the main characters in the main plot speak in poetic language, very elevated poetry, and in the plot and the comic scenes, the minor characters speak in very ordinary, prosaic kind of a language, which often borders on kind of crudity also in some instances. So let us get back to Sanskrit literature, the vast body of the epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata, the poetic dramas, the great lyrics, the great lyrical or narrative poems like Meghdut. These narrative poems are also called, in the modern parlance, there is a term for them, quotation, verse, V-E-R-S-E, novels, quotation closed. So because they have all the qualities of a storytelling, character, plot, beginning, end, and a dialogue, of course, they are described as verse novels. The dramatic poems and the narrative poems in English literature also are described as verse novels. There are many examples like Browning's dramatic monologues and his dramatic poetry and the ballads, and of course great famous poems like Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade and so on. And prose was written in Sanskrit literature, but not in the form of the novel. Another point which we should be very clear about is that novel as a form did not exist in the ancient Sanskrit literature or ancient literature. It came, even in English literature, it came only later on. Verse and drama were the first expressions, and then novel took form in the 18th century when prose developed to a point. It automatically or spontaneously, it grew into the form of the novel. Another great masterpieces of Sanskrit literature, ancient Sanskrit literature, like Chanakyaniti and Arthashastra. Chanakyaniti is written in verse. Arthashastra is a mixture of prose and verse. There's a vast body of Sanskrit religious and philosophical literature as well, and all of it is mostly primarily predominantly in the poetic form, and Puranas and Vedas and Upanishads, they are all written in the form of shlokas and hymns, and the explanations or observations or certain philosophical discourses are in the form of prose. But hymns and shlokas all have the form of versification. It does not follow a rigorous rhyme scheme as such. And they are ritualistic explanations which are often in verse and in prose as well. Another great body of work which comes in Sanskrit literature and from the ancient times are the stories of the Panchtantra. Novel as a form was not known, but short stories existed in folklores as a form of oral storytelling, in folk tales, and Panchtantra, a famous collection of folk tales, mostly orally spoken, and the form could be in verse or it could be spoken as a story, or it was comprised later on, but it was mostly oral storytelling, a mixture of prose and verse. So Padya or poetry, it dominates the ancient Sanskrit literature, and it does not have a rigorous rhyme scheme, but it has a vast variety, and it is religious, it is philosophical, it is narrative, it is in the form of epic, and it is in the form of drama, poetic drama, and also very, very romantic as well as religious in nature. Now, the actually to categorize prose and verse is, of course, they are certainly different forms of expression, but there are certain characteristics which belong to both. And poetry can be prosaic and prose can be poetic. The blank verse in which the poetic dramas were written, and these poetic dramas, the form of the poetic drama was revived by T.S. Eliot in the 20th century in Murray in the Cathedral. These poetic dramas had the form of the poetry, but they had the qualities of characterization, dialogue, and of course a story. And so they were like verse novels, or even the long epics or the long narrative poems. They were verse novels or verse dramas because they had characterization, they had dialogue, and in the blank verse, though there was no rigorous rhyme scheme, but they had the poetic essence, that is in compression, in lyricism, and in the spirit of imagination and imagery. And of course, it is called the blank verse because it did not have a rigorous rhyme scheme, and it lent itself beautifully to soliloquies and to monologues. But these blank verses did not have a technical closed rhyme scheme, but they had a very fluid rhythm. They had all the devices of poetry, like imagination, and this is the element. This is true of both blank verse and free verse as well. Sometimes these forms of blank verse and free verse were also called prose poetry. So we have poetic drama, poetic novels, poetry novels, and prose poetry, because poetry can be prosaic and prose can be poetic. Soliloquies and dramatic monologues were very effective in blank verse or free verse. And in the modern literature, of course, the modern poetry is always in free verse, but it has the essence of poetry, and it is also called prose quotation, prose poetry. So these are new terms which we should make ourselves familiar with and maybe understand them. Quotation, verse, novels, quotation closed, poetic dramas within quotations, and prose poetry within quotations. The heroic dramas, like we have heroic poems also, or narrative poems. The heroic dramas always had a closed rhyme scheme. They were in heroic couplets. And so many of these heroic dramas or narrative poems or dramatic poems, they have that kind of declamation, which the heroic couplets can make very, very effective, or it is perfectly suited to them. Prose has generally it has the rhythm of common speech and also the grammatical structure of common speech. It can, while poetry is more metaphorical, and it has more imagery, and it has more of a fluidity in expression. Prose can be declamatory and it can be bombastic also, as we have seen in many speeches or orations or dramatic monologues or soliloquies. And this form of being a very bombastic, over-the-top speech is present in many great pieces of poems as well. Like I gave you the example of the Charge of Light Brigade, or the heroic poems, or the ballads, or that monologue is present in Browning's poem, particularly his My Last Duchess. So we can feel, or we do understand, and it is more acceptable to find that these qualities of prose and poetry overlap, and it is quite clear. Though poetry is considered superior to prose by many critics. In fact, the novels like Wuthering Heights, because they have such a lyrical quality, many critics have called it a great epic, or a great, a very poetic novel, and so on. And prose does not have, or it seems to have less of a quality of imagination as generally understood. And some critics like Charlotte Mason have said, quotation, "Poetry is the highest form of literature." And perhaps that is why the poetic plays of Shakespeare are among the greatest forms of literature, while Congreve's or the Restoration drama, which is in prose, though it has wit and humor and brilliant wordplay, is not to that level of elevated level of expression as we feel. Of course, we can have our own favorites. And in the modern times, the lines are blurring. There is no definite category as such. And there is generally more of a liberal attitude. And certain things which were not acceptable before are now, like in prose also, we have in the very literary novels, certain slang words or everyday speech or ungrammatical language is also present. And a landmark moment was in the year 2016 when Bob Dylan, the pop singer, the songwriter, the pop music icon, won the Nobel Prize for Literature. So that was a great shift in the attitudes, and the purists of the late 19th century, led by Henry James and others, they now, their standards are, we can say, more diluted now, and we can also feel, or we can also accept certain ideas which overlap, and not have a very, very rigid attitude towards what literature actually should be, offered in completely in a definite category. Thank you for listening, and please go to my channel, Literati.